and how are other places doing things differently. So we had someone from Australia comment in, some from the US, from Ireland, to really be able to look at these in a comparative and a critical question to say, what are the strengths of our system, what are the limitations, and where do we need to make change?
And are you involved at all in discussions with either Revenue Canada or political decision makers on these issues? Or is it mainly within the program?
Part of what we need and want to do is to animate those discussions. You probably know of some of the work that the Mutar Foundation does in these kinds of conversations, but there's a whole variety of other ways in which we need to engage those conversations. So we welcome taking them forward. Being based in Ottawa has a certain advantage in that regard.
Ricky, were you involved in these discussions? Were you involved at any time in these discussions?
Yes.
What were you
Not
doing?
so much with, a little bit with Revenue Canada, but more, it was before I came to Oxfam, actually, when I was at CCIC, when there was a debate in Canada about changing the regulations, the CRA regulations. That was, Paul Martin made some changes in terms of eligibility, for example, of stocks and bonds for charitable registration. So he was open to a widening, and then we were also discussing to what extent it would be possible to change the definition and the regulations. And we did some research at that time around work that was going on particularly in Great Britain, around the renovation of the charity law, which in Britain was done quite successfully. And here in Canada, I think the international charities there were some that were interested, and CCIC put some time and effort into it, but the domestic charitable sector at that point was not so concerned. I think since that time, probably a few of the foundations have become more interested. But the thing is that now, when there is so much more responsiveness to complaints as excuses for witch hunts, that it's almost either we missed the boat or we're coming up to another possibility for revision.
There is very little history of that. There is a lady in Halifax who's working on the history of taxation in Canada, and she's still not come around that one. And our very own historian of taxation, who was at your foundation meeting, I think, and I asked him because of my taxation question for that Oxfam had to spend a year and all that, and he could not retrieve that bit of taxation very quickly. So there's a lot of work to be done to see, at which time what changed and everything in parallel with Britain. It's in the book on the history of Oxfam in Britain, how they fought initially to be able to be, but they're constantly fighting for their own advocacy. But how and when that works is not well researched whatsoever. And it's hard, and for people like me who are bored to tears by taxation to actually go and do that history. It's a hard thing to retrieve, but it's fundamental.
Well, nobody seems to want to change the Elizabethan definition.
I know.
Well, just the first thing I want to say is incredible appreciation for taking us to St. John's and through that history, which was foundational to the Oxfam mind. And whether the founding myth was myth or not, you could tell in the evidence that you brought forward how powerful it was. But on this discussion that you raised, I guess one of the things that comes to mind is, Aretha Franklin, R-E-S-P-E-C-T. And not so much on the taxation side, but I mean, at Oxfam and on the board of CCIC, going through the whole voluntary sector initiative under the Chrétien government,
Yes.
in
Yes.
which so much effort went into how the government should properly relate to these organizations, whether they were football clubs, health auxiliaries, international organizations, or whatever.
Or the Canadian Historical Association.
Pardon?
We're stuck with that as well. The Canadian Historical Association. We're stuck with that.
And there was this sense, in a sense, of mutual respect, and there were guidelines for how, in a sense, activist organizations should lobby or make representations, and how they should be received, and transparency and all that. And to my mind, that has all evaporated. It evaporated under the Chrétien Martin government, but since then, it's just been thrown onto the garbage. And also, of course, the language that is being used now is it's like Back to the Future, future to the past. It's Thatcherite, purely and simply. And Oxfam UK went through all that 30 years ago.
So, yeah.
And Australia since, and so on.
John used to be director of Oxfam too, and you're a historian now. So there's a future for history when people retire. We were on the same panel on
He's not a new historian, his PhD's in history, so he's an old historian.
Old historian, back in history. Anyway, doing a lot of archival work on the
Right.
Canadian Conference of Churches, and it's very interesting to do. Yeah.
Yeah, Lawrence Cumming, another of the aforementioned Gang of Four. This is fascinating piece of history, and I was particularly interested in what you said about the current confusion, anger about closing offices, and then, of course, the dreadful fire. What's your sense of where this piece of history is going?
Which piece of history? The history of?
The history of the St. John's Oxfam Centre and Oxfam in Newfoundland.
I was there only for 2 days, so it's very hard. One of the answers I've already given is that it's, when you do that history and you say, I'm doing a history of an NGO, that's what I do, that's my class. Now,
Yeah.
People travel from governmental organization to non-governmental organization all the time, to the UN, so it's very hard to isolate your topic. So in this case, there is the house, and the house it's not there anymore, an extraordinary place. And because it was that, right, like we didn't have one like that in Ottawa, because it was that, because it's there in many communities in the UK, a lot of things happened. But then it was there for a reason as well. So that is dramatic because the place is an actor. So that's a very sad thing. That there's an interruption. There really something has been interrupted. Sorry. It was waning. It might or might not have closed, but it might have been reassigned, right? Like the bottom part was reassigned. It might have been recreated. Now it's going to be hard, right? This is prime gentrification, downtown land. Where do you put that thing again? Like in Ottawa, we've got, the blind people thing, which was right in the middle, is now way too far for blind people to go to. It's the same extraordinary thing that happens to these old charities. So whatever reopens, it's not going to be that. And that's the fire really put an end to something. Then after that, there was the problems, the vagaries of provincial, municipal politics, of trade unionism, all that was very important. It's hard to see a lot of disappointed people, and there's a frustration, there's some energy that is just not going anywhere, right? That seems to be just I don't know. I can't say. I mean, there are things that are traveling. Kelly illustrated one of the main public health tale for children that is traveling in Africa in all sorts of languages, and is been translated again and again. So the things are traveling. I think methods are being reappropriated. I think that there are many articles now on the web and charities on the web and all that, and some of the imaginative campaigns are being reconverted, like the tag campaign and all that, which came from a very local experiment. But the problem is that these local experiments don't exist anymore, then you don't feel that. The other thing which is striking, and I speak like an Ottawan as well, is that house fostered long-term commitment. And as you all know, voluntary activity now tends to be much more short-term. And it's very hard for the sustainability of these local ventures. And I think that was visible there. So I don't really have a good answer to that.
Can you talk a little bit about the other kinds of institutions in St. John's? I mean, the way I hear you talking, there's nothing like it in St. John's. It's absolutely unique. Is that a fair conclusion?
Well, there's all sorts of things. I mean, the reason why it's there is because of the unions, where they're like John Green's dad was from Fogo Island. He was a fisherman. He was raised in a tradition of workmen's solidarity and self-improvement, right? So when I speak about these traditions, I'm saying it's not a chance that this happened. It's because there were existing traditions of involvement. Where it became unique is on its international outlook. It's by the trade union, NAPE would not have had that lively an outreach branch had it not been fostered by Oxfam. It was there, but then it was really fostered and helped and nourished by Oxfam. The same for the nurses, right? But the nurses were there, and they had their network and all that. So it's kind of a cross-fertilization of many institutions that are very also locally important and that irradiate in the whole province. But where they are unique is that, and they're not that unique anymore for that. Now there's a lot of international students at Memorial. So, and when the CBC, who had their office not very far in the early 90s, I think late 80s, saw 4 African guys walking down the street. They phoned Oxfam to say, "Are they your guys?" Yeah, because for them, international meant Oxfam. When some Filipino fishermen were, enslaved on a ship and tried to fly away and to demand asylum, the mayor and the fishermen asked Oxfam to do something. So they were very quickly the place to go to when the churches wanted to do something, when the teachers wanted to do something. So, but now there is more international education in schools, so these skits are not as useful. So, there is a clear central role, I think, and for the anti-poverty thing. But now there's the internet, the phone and the postal box, which were crucial to that place, are not as important.
Are the churches at all important?
Sorry?
Are the churches, in terms of international work, important in St. John's?
Well, what Lorraine was doing and what the Sisters of Presentation were doing was, at their own momentum. Otherwise, I don't know enough about it. I know that because of this, the church's energies and all that were in total disrepute because of the scandals of sexual abuse, and that gave a real blow to any kind of church, anything, for years, right? It was very, very difficult, the whole community.
Hi, my name is Erin. I used to be Oxfam's regional youth liaison for Newfoundland and Labrador.
Oh,
so
wow.
First I want to thank you for this presentation. It was fascinating to hear the stories behind these posters that I would see every Wednesday when I went to visit Bill and Linda, who were incredible influences on my life and leadership. And so I just wanted to add a few comments, especially in response to the last 2 questions. So first, with regards to, I think there's a really important contextual piece also about how Newfoundland has changed over this time and how that's informed the history of Oxfam in Newfoundland. My mother grew up with 6 kids sharing a bed, heads and feet alternating. I grew up in a very well-to-do suburb of St. John's, And it was in traveling to places like Nicaragua that I felt like I actually understood more of my mom's background. It actually resembled her childhood with subsistence agriculture more than my childhood did. And so while it's true that the solidarity movements shifted partially because obviously things happening in places like Central America had shifted, another big change is that in Newfoundland we went from being a place that was largely impoverished to a place where you see a lot of wealth and increasingly a significant amount of disparity, of course. But it's shifted so that the connection to the local isn't always as clear. Another big shift that's happened, I think, with particularly the public outreach in Newfoundland has been the student activism. So our campus, I used to be president of the Oxfam chapter. We're the longest running university chapter of all of the Oxfams. It's now in its 16th year. And so one lucky thing is that our archives are all on Facebook rather than in the Oxfam house. And then there's a lot of history in the university center.
Really careful about keeping digital stuff. That's another chapter of preservation. It's true, but where is it going to be in 20 years? It's a hell of a question.
That's true.
Yeah.
So we'll have to follow up on that. And so that's linked to that though. I think there's also been a really interesting rift between the youth movement of Oxfam, which has been extremely active, regular meetings, outreach events, fundraisers every week or 2 weeks or so, and the local outreach, which had really been waning in the past number of years. And particularly on the issue of closing the office. It was something that most of the youth who were active in Newfoundland thought was a pretty logical thing to do, given that we were a development organization. So why do we have an office in a place that has 500,000 people? And where there isn't a lot of need for local work, or there wasn't a lot of local work happening in solidarity, it was more so public outreach. And so, but our voices, I don't think we weren't very vocal because there is also, there's a very real tension there and a very real perception of betrayal, I think, in sharing those opinions and experiences. So.
Thank you very much. You know what, well, first of all, I need to have your name, but if some of you ever want to say stuff online, you can go to my website and comment on my, there's a place for that talk if you want to write about it, but I'll try to talk to you anyway, but thank you very much for all that.
So I'm Robert Fox, I work for Oxfam. Because underlying Erin's position is, we're very much struggling ourselves with sort of understanding the nature of place, and we come from a strong history of activism within Canada, and we come from a strong clarity that our biggest contribution to changing the world is to change Canadians and to have an impact on attitudes and behaviors in this country. But when we look at the St. John's experience, and it's not unique because we can find it in other parts of Canada as well, but it was extraordinary because it is a place that had a class analysis that you wouldn't find broadly to the same extent in a Toronto, but you might find it in a Sudbury, right? It had a place of, it was the hinterland. Its sense of colonialism and the history of colonialism and the people who were powerful, who lived on the hill or were away, and their day-to-day experience was within a generation, and I pick up very much on the point that Erin made, within a generation, this was their experience. Whereas in a Toronto and a Montreal, in a Vancouver, there's no shortage of class dynamics and there's no shortage of inequality, but the way people perceive that was quite different than in a St. John's until, as I say, literally this last generation. So those aha moments were so powerful and so palpable in the sense of the parallels that people could draw between their lived experience in their community and Toronto was the bad guy, or a pan-Canadian government was the bad guy, or the families, the Crosby families were the bad, there was a face and an edge to inequality that, as I say, you might find as well in a Kitimat or in a Sudbury that you don't necessarily find in a lot of other metropolitan centers. That I think was very, very much then the lived experience and gave such salience to so much of the international work that happened in St. John's. But there is also then this generational phenomenon where a 20-year-old in St. John's today has more in common with a 20-year-old in Vancouver than with a 60-year-old in St. John's. And that is actually changing then the nature of how you engage with whom you engage. A 20-year-old at Memorial right now sees themselves as a global citizen, and their mother or their grandfather sees themselves as a St. Johner against the world. And that also has a dimension in terms of how this story plays out and its past and its future.
And to do that, I mean, I've not done the history of no regional office yet, right? That's the first one. I did it in a kind of emergency. So I suppose I'm going to discover some of these discrepancies if I do Toronto in a similar way. And I have done interviews in the core of the 60-year-olds, right? So I do, and I tried at the end to speak about transformations, and partly, you know, these 60-year-olds are themselves part of that transformation. I mean, they help bring along that global sense. So I'm aware it's a complicated story, and you've not even started to talk about the internet and the communication and the technology. That's paramount in histories of NGOs, the technological landscape. Very important, because you rely so much on education and publicity that these changes can, you know, very much, you know, call for drastic transformations in new methods.
I just wanted to add yet more to what Erin has said. I mean, one of the things that was striking to me was that, except for that one no sweat poster that says exploitation is never in fashion, there is nothing in what you showed us that was after 1999. And in fact, when you look at the work that Oxfam in St. John, particularly Bill and Linda and the Munn Group did between 1999 and now, what is striking is their ability to do campaigning on a more sophisticated level, including using the internet, but particularly all the work that's done on the purchasing policies within universities, in which Munn and Bill played a very significant role, and that's reached across the country and has included municipal purchasing policies. So when you, and the work on education, so when you look at those campaigns, which were sort of post old
Local.
Oxfam,
Yeah.
post-local, but we're still local and global at the same time, but in a very different way. That's not part of the story, and I'm sure there are very good reasons
Yeah,
why, but it's part of this kind of...
Yeah, and I distributed that thing for that,
Yeah.
I'm sorry, but my worry on this one, maybe I'm completely wrong and I don't know the story as much as you do, is that what if that energy and that creativity came from that? I'm just worried that, because to me I recognize in these campaigns on water and fair trade and all that, the same energy. I'm just worried that, will that survive the delocalization of charity? You know, is some of that creativity not born from deep roots in one community? I don't know that.
I think one of the geniuses is that, I mean, you can see Bill's fingerprint on some of those global campaigns.
Yeah.
You can absolutely see it.
Yeah.
Particularly the work on purchasing policies. So I think that in the best of all possible worlds, you don't sacrifice the one
Yeah.
for the other.
Yeah.
And I think, oh, sorry.
Just another footnote, which you didn't mention very much of, is the cultural connection. The fact that so many unique things came out of Oxfam and St. John's is closely related to Costco, Bizarre has, and Mary Walsh. And the madness of that creativity intermingled with the Oxfam staff and volunteers, and the loyalties were very strong.
but it also raises, we do need to have an interesting question in today's sector. Who are which organizations are the kind of boundary spanners that Oxfam was, and was because of place, but the ability to connect trade unions and the women's movement and a whole variety of different movements, or have we become so very specialized by causes that it's now difficult to really connect all of those different pieces together in a different kind of solidarity, or a different kind of way of thinking about and bringing together. Dominique, again, I'm sure there may be people who want to hang around and have a chat. Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you for coming. As I say, part of what we're trying to do with the program is to have these kinds of conversations, to bring policymakers and others into them. And Dominique's also given us a new project, which is to really think about archives of small organizations. We were fortunate here at Carleton that when CPRN closed, we acquired their archives, which are now, those papers are now just finally being fully archived and will be available. But it's an important project to make sure that this history is involved. Again, thank you.
And thank you to Elsa for documenting the project.
For those of you who are interested, our next event is our first annual lecture, the TD lecture, in philanthropy. It's will be presented by Bradford Smith, who is president and CEO of the Foundation Center, based in New York, but he has extraordinary international experience. And then we have a panel of three executives of Canadian foundations reflecting on how his remarks might apply to the Canadian context. Barbara McGuinness from the Community Foundation of Ottawa, Sandy Houston from the Metcalf, who's also president of the Philanthrothink Foundations of Canada, and Scott Mullen, who from TD Foundation. November 4th, same place. So, thank you.
Okay, well does she know that? Because I think that's really important.
Well,
I didn't realize it.
Big fight.
They both have it. If the government has its way, yeah, that's right.
Exactly.
Are you still interested in mayor by any chance? No. Remember mayor too? Good to see you.
Yes, I was emotionally just. And now we're just
so it sounds like you're doing some exciting work.
I was just asking Robert, my name's Lou Hour, and I was just telling Susan, I know years ago.
No, I don't have any world digital
I think the only board member from our ago. There's nothing we're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was.
Different topics and different.
Yeah.
Oh, jeez. Some good ones and some bad ones.
Everyone else is taking notes, seem to follow.
No, sorry,
I encourage you to do that.
I was always reminded of that.
So, that, you know, I mean,
Interesting.
there's a conversation.